Sarah is useless even in a kitchen. She can't even serve a decent meal at home. Everyone's cold gaze is suddenly turned towards me. Seeing me like this, Paul seemed to get even more carried away and started to boast loudly. My wife's cooking is terrible, huh? What? Have you ever eaten my cooking? Aren't you always eating at your mistress' place? What? I loudly denounced Paul's infidelity. It's not a lie. I have proof right here. I pointed to the documents held by my father-in-law. My name is Sarah Reed, 35 years old. I have always been intimidated by the assertiveness that is often characteristic of men, and as a result, I have had very few romantic relationships and virtually no experience dating men. As I reached the age commonly referred to as in your 40s, my parents became concerned and started to suggest arranged marriages. Initially, I refused, but with few opportunities to meet men and pressure from my parents, I felt a rush to marry and went on several arranged dates. One of these was with Paul. Paul was a kind, serious man who worked as a lead employee at a top company. He was big both in height and build, but surprisingly, he didn't have an intimidating presence. And I wasn't scared of him. The talks about marriage progressed smoothly, and I even met Paul's parents. Paul's family ran a chess class and were masters of a famous school. Paul's father was a grandmaster of chess, a quiet and strict man. He always wore a suit, and I naturally straightened my posture when I met him. On the other hand, his mother was gentle, with a soft demeanor, and her smile would create dimples. Paul and I decided to get married. My parents were thrilled, saying I was marrying into a wealthy family. The condition for the marriage was that I would become a housewife, so I resigned from my clerical job at an electronics manufacturer. Even then, my colleagues teased me endlessly about marrying into wealth. Looking back, that was probably the peak of my happiness. Paul said, I'm busy with work now and might not be able to come home often, but please bear with it for a while. Paul wanted to achieve certain results in his current job before quitting to help with the family business. I thought it was good to be committed to one's work, so I supported him. Years into the marriage, Paul hardly ever came home. I knew he wouldn't be able to come home often, but I didn't expect it to be this bad. I was alone in the living room of our apartment, waiting for Paul. This apartment was provided by Paul's parents when we got married. He's not coming home again today. I've only managed to cook for Paul a few times. Not only does Paul hardly ever come home, but since we got married, it's been rare for him to come home normally. He often goes on business trips, leaving the house empty for days at a time. Dinner is almost always out, and it's normal for Paul to come home late. He leaves early in the morning, despite coming home late. I was really worried whether Paul was getting enough sleep or eating nutritious food. He would leave the house without eating breakfast. I once called Paul in the morning and asked him why he wouldn't eat at home. Paul, I wish you would eat properly. Paul, without even looking at me, was tying his tie. It's okay. I'm just really busy with work right now. Don't worry about it. With that, Paul would leave the house immediately. Even on holidays, Paul works from early in the morning until late at night, regardless of whether it's a Saturday, Sunday, or a public holiday. He's often away on business trips too. In the beginning, I thought maybe Paul was trying to be considerate by not being home too much. Or perhaps he was embarrassed. and I found that thought somewhat endearing. As this situation of him not being home continued, it felt like I was living alone. Paul's belongings are minimal, just the bare necessities. Naturally, we hardly ever talk, so I don't know anything about his hobbies, what foods he likes or dislikes. I wondered if it was my fault. I've talked to my parents about it, but they said it's good for a man to be busy with work, and they didn't take my concerns seriously. My few friends think it's better for a husband to be out earning money and not being at home too much. They even said they were envious, not taking my words too hard. Paul handles the finances, but he does give me a proper allowance for our living expenses every month, so I don't have any financial worries. This lack of financial worries, in turn, makes me anxious. I can't help but blame myself, wondering if I've done something to make Paul dislike me. I've started to question if there's something lacking in me as a wife. I meticulously take care of cleaning and have been studying cooking to prepare delicious meals. On the rare occasions when Paul sees my anxious face, he tries to dispel my worries. Sarah, you're doing just fine. I try to convince myself that this is just another form of marriage, but I was scolded by my father-in-law the other day. I received a call from him at the end of the year, which was unusual. As I picked up, he shouted so loudly that I dropped the phone. "Sir, what kind of nerve do you have?" "Huh? Did something happen?" "Don't play dumb. Why haven't you attended the family gatherings? And it's been over a year." I was shocked because I hadn't heard about these family gatherings before. I had discussed with Paul about greeting for Christmas, and he had told me that we don't gather because his chess students come for greetings. He also said that the family doesn't gather because it gets too chaotic with so many people. Normally, only Paul goes back home with Christmas greetings. If you're not going to attend this year either, shouldn't you at least apologize for not being able to join? His stern voice made me freeze. I had been staying home, thinking it was usual for Paul to visit his parents alone during the Christmas. I had been careful with Christmas cards and greetings, thinking I was being respectful. I had suggested to Paul that we should at least make a phone call, but he said it was incredibly busy during the year-end and Christmas, and I thought that might be expected in the family. I was afraid of meeting my strict father-in-law, not without reason. According to him, the family gathers on December 24th for a Christmas meeting, and the students come for greetings from December 25th. All I could do was apologize profusely over the phone. After his harsh words, he hung up. After the call, my mind was filled with questions. What did Paul mean by "Sarah doesn't need to come"? Why did he lie about the family gatherings not happening? Was he trying to keep me from attending that much? That night, just as the day changed, Paul came home. I felt it was now or never, so I asked him about the Christmas gathering. "I received a phone call from your father today. He was angry that I didn't attend the Christmas gathering." Paul sighed and replied reluctantly, "Going to such a large gathering can be daunting. Plus, many wives dislike visiting their husbands' family homes. That's why I thought I was being considerate." I was astounded by Paul's misguided attempt at consideration. Indeed, many people dislike visiting their spouse's family home. My friends complain about not wanting to go, but never going at all is surely unreasonable. Despite Paul's reluctance, I decided to insist on attending the gathering. The Reed family's Christmas gathering was a grand affair. Many relatives gathered, exchanging greetings. Finally, you've shown your face. It's natural for family members to attend such events. His words were stern. Even when I mentioned that Paul had told me there were no family gatherings, my father-in-law remained furious. You've been avoiding us because you didn't want to see us, right? His anger was so intense that I couldn't find a way to respond and I gave up on rebutting. The relatives all looked at me with disdain. I thought it was inevitable. I decided to endure it. What I couldn't stand, though, was that Paul did nothing to help. Instead, he just silently drank his alcohol. As everyone drank more, they started coming up to me to complain. Paul has always said he's never seen you do any housework. In my heart, I whispered, it's because Paul hardly ever comes home. You rarely cook, and when you do, it's not tasty. So he ends up eating out all the time. The words from the relatives were all unfamiliar to me. What had Paul been telling them? I couldn't understand why he was disparaging me. I'm sorry, I'll be more careful from now on. Overwhelmed by their harsh words, all I could do was stiffen up and apologize. I helped in the kitchen and served drinks, feeling like I was sitting on pins and needles. After barely getting through the gathering and greetings from the students, I returned home exhausted. Paul said he was going to work from his parents' home, and, like on the way there, we went our separate ways on the way back. Looking back, it was all so strange. Why had Paul said there was no family gathering? And why was he spreading rumors that I was a bad wife who didn't do housework? Was there a connection to him not coming home? I couldn't stop thinking about it once I started. Fortunately, I had plenty of time. I decided to follow Paul's movements, like the detectives say in TV dramas, a stop out. I followed Paul one morning as he left her house in a hurry. I knew where his office was, so it was easy to tell him there. I felt a bit excited, like a detective, which was more fulfilling than spending the day doing nothing at home. I killed time in cafes and restaurants near his office and followed Paul when he went out. He returned to the office in the evening without doing anything suspicious. Watching from a cafe with a view of his office, I saw Paul leave around 7 p.m. Maybe he finished work early today. If he went straight home, he'd realize I was out. I hurried back home. I managed to get home before Paul and prepare dinner, waiting for him. However, Paul didn't return until after midnight. Feeling that something was amiss, I decided to conduct a follow-up the next day. Paul's actions from morning to evening were the same. Go to the office, leave for a bit, and return in the evening. The issue was what happened afterward. Watching from a different restaurant, I saw Paul leave the office around 6 p.m. Today, I followed him directly. Instead of heading to the station to go home, he started walking in a different direction. I hesitated for a moment. Paul walked toward a downtown area filled with hotels. I decided to follow him, but lost sight of him. As I was looking around, Paul suddenly appeared in front of me. Both of us were surprised, staring at each other. Paul was the first to speak. Sarah, what are you doing here? I couldn't come up with a good excuse and ended up mumbling. What are you doing in a place like this during the day? I was shocked. Paul was the suspicious one. Yet I was being treated as if I was doing something wrong. Anyway, go home. We'll talk after that. Embarrassed to be scolded by Paul in such a pace, I hurried home. As soon as Paul came home late at night, he confronted me with something outrageous. So, you've been idling at home and now you're following your husband around? Why should I have to support someone like that? I tried to protest quietly. I do take care of the house. Don't say you're doing housework just because you clean a little. From now on, manage with $100 for living expenses. I was speechless. How am I supposed to live on $100? The utility bills are deducted from my account. Besides, you won't have to spend on my food. Paul smiled maliciously. Then at least let me work. Let me get a part-time job. Paul looked down on me, his lips twisted. No, you work full-time like me, and don't slack on the housework. Despite my objections, Paul's determination was unyielding. Eventually, I had to comply and return to my previous job at the electrical manufacturer. I ended up having to do all the housework while working. My life became incredibly busy overnight. I couldn't play detective anymore, caught up in the daily grind of work and chores. Since then, Paul has become like a different person, constantly finding fault with me and complaining about the housework. In the short moments we saw each other in the morning, he would complain. The windows are dirty. There is dust in the entrance. The shirts aren't ironed properly, and then leave for work. I have to do all these chores at night since I work during the day. As the end of the year approached and the Christmas gathering drew near, Paul, as usual, told me not to attend. You stay at home. You don't need to come to the gathering. I stayed silent, thinking arguing was futile. As Paul left, he threw a parting shot. I can't show someone like you to my relatives. It would be embarrassing. I was shocked by his harsh words. How could Paul say such things? I work from nothing till night and handle all the housework on top of that. Anyway, I decided to attend the Christmas gathering without telling Paul. And then I had to make Paul's true nature known to my father-in-law and mother-in-law. I clutched the thick envelope that had arrived earlier tightly. On the day of the Christmas gathering, I arrived at the Reed family home to attend. I took a deep breath and opened the front door. Seeing me suddenly appear at the Christmas gathering, Paul was surprised, but due to being in front of everyone, he just glared at me without saying anything. The relatives' gazes were as cold as ever, whispering accusation against me. It was clear they had been deceived by my husband. I didn't let it bother me. Enduring their cold stares, I stood in the kitchen, preparing food and drinks. After a while, as the alcohol began to affect him, Paul started loudly criticizing me. Sarah is useless even if she's in the kitchen. She never cooked a decent meal at home. All the cold gazes suddenly turned towards me. Seeing me in such a state, Paul, perhaps feeling encouraged, began to boast loudly. My wife's cooking is terrible. My father-in-law's stern gaze was directed at me. What on earth is going on? What are you doing? Maybe you're not suitable to be Paul's wife. As my father-in-law raised his voice, all the relatives' gazes suddenly focused on me. Just as it seemed my father-in-law was about to start lecturing, I stood up in front of Paul and began to retort. Huh? Have you ever eaten my cooking? Isn't that always at your mistress' place? What? My father-in-law was taken aback, his mouth half open. What are you starting to say? While everyone was stunned, Paul began to make excuses in a fluttered manner. Come on, Sarah. Just because you're spoken ill of, why would you tell such lies? Turning back to his father, Paul began to make excuses. Dad, I don't have a mistress. That must be the case. My father-in-law wanted to believe Paul. He nodded more to Paul's words than to mine. Thinking he had gained his father's trust, Paul began to retort with confidence. Stop saying ridiculous things. You are really out of your mind. It wasn't just a bluff when I said Paul had a mistress. I took an envelope out of my bag and showed the documents inside to my father-in-law and the others. Paul continued to harshly criticize me without concern. Apologize right now, then I'll forgive you for lying. The relatives probably believed Paul didn't have a mistress and looked at me with harsh gazes. My father-in-law and mother-in-law were honestly reading the documents. The documents I handed over were the result of an investigation into Paul's affair. Since Paul's actions were clearly suspicious, I had a detective agency take over the investigation thoroughly. The results from the detective agency were damning. Paul was definitely cheating. The reason Paul didn't come home was that he was meeting his mistress. He mostly spent his time at his mistress' house and sometimes used hotels, as reported. Paul was always eating at his mistress' place. While I managed our living expenses with just $100, worked full-time and took care of the old household chores, Paul was cozying up with his mistress. When I encountered Paul in the hotel district, he was about to have a secret meeting with his mistress in a hotel. I loudly accused Paul of his affair. It's not a lie. Here's the evidence. I pointed to the document held by my father-in-law. The apartment Paul entered isn't ours. Murmurs of doubt rose from the relatives. Hey, Paul, is this true? What's going on? Is this made up? My father-in-law and mother-in-law were scrutinizing the documents as if trying to bore holes through them. Paul, is this true? Sweating profusely, Paul desperately denied it. No, that's not it. There's no way I have a mistress. What my father-in-law and mother-in-law were engrossed in were the photos. Photos of Paul holding hands with an unknown woman entering an unfamiliar apartment. Photos of them selecting jewelry together in the jewelry store. Photos of them drinking wine in a stylish restaurant. Photos of them picking out groceries in the supermarket. In all of them, Paul's carefree smile was captured. I pressed Paul relentlessly. Paul, you said you were busy with overtime every day, right? Paul's face turned red, and he fell silent. My anger made me speak rapidly. Not wanting to meet with relatives, say my cooking isn't good. Why did you tell such lies? I didn't tell any lies. Even at this point, Paul was trying to feign ignorance. This attitude deeply disappointed me. Our exchange silenced everyone. Then my mother-in-law's loud voice filled the room. Paul, what are you doing? Paul was taken aback by his mother's sudden outburst. No, that's not it. My mother-in-law's usually gentle face was gone, replaced by a furious expression that even scared me, who wasn't being scolded. What's different? Are you saying all of this is fabricated? She spoke calmly now, but this calmness was somehow even more intimidating. No one in the family could speak under her intense presence. So, the story about Sarah was a lie you made up. Now explain yourself properly. Whispers such as, I've never seen her so angry. She's always smiling, but she's the scariest one mad, spread among the relatives. Seemingly resigned, Paul sat on the floor, made himself small, and began to speak in a quiet voice. That woman was someone I dated before we were married, whom I met at a nightclub in New York City. The relatives began to murmur. Both my father-in-law and mother-in-law stared at Paul with stern faces. This family is strict, so marrying a woman from a nightclub would never be accepted. Was Paul crying? Dots of moisture spotted on the floor. So I thought just marry someone suitable on paper, and I could live at her place. And that someone suitable was me. Paul apologized. I'm sorry, you said you weren't interested in marriage, and I thought as long as I provided money, everything would be fine. Then, a question popped into my head. Then, why did you badmouth me to your parents? Without those bad words, I wouldn't have been so suspicious. I wanted her to be my real wife. I couldn't stand the idea of living with someone like Sarah, whom I don't even like. I wanted to divorce somehow. Do you realize how selfish you're being? Paul seemed to shrink even more. I'm sorry. I've always been told I'm not endowed until I'm married, so I thought I had to get married at least. And once divorced, I thought they wouldn't bother me about getting married again. Paul had gambled that once divorced, his parents wouldn't meddle in his affairs, allowing him to focus on his relationship with his mistress. He needed a pretext for divorce, making it look like I was at fault. That's why he badmouthed me, to tarnish my reputation. Limiting my living expenses to $100 was to prevent me from investigating his cheating. With only that much money and working full-time, I wouldn't have the time or resources to probe further. He hadn't anticipated I would use the detective agency. His oversight led to his moment, with Paul apologizing on his knees before the family. I told you infidelity is the worst. You betrayed Sarah, who has been so devoted. Veins throbbed on her forehead, her anger nowhere near subsiding. Paul remained with his forehead to the floor, tears and snot streaming down his face. Paul, you are a disgrace to our family. We disown you. The gathered relatives gasped. Her word was likely final. My father-in-law nodded in agreement. Paul had lost his place in this family, exposed for his infidelity and vice, and now disowned by his own mother. Paul struggled to his feet, wiped his tears, and left the room without a word. After Paul left, my mother-in-law came over to me and apologized while holding my hand. Sarah, I'm so sorry for what Paul has done. He's been terrible. My father-in-law also apologized. We're truly sorry. You should divorce him. It's okay. My mother-in-law continued to hold my hand with tears in her voice. To think that Paul was such a person, we were completely deceived by him. I'm so sorry for scolding you so harshly over things that weren't true. I had thought my father-in-law was always angry and stubborn, but he was quick to admit his mistake and apologize, showing his good nature. It was clear that this family was held together thanks to my mother-in-law. It was puzzling how Paul, with such good parents, could become so mean-spirited and disdainful towards others. I reconciled with my in-laws, and sooner after, my divorce from Paul was finalized. The divorce was, ironically, what Paul had wanted. After being disowned by his family due to his affair, Paul, no longer having the backing of a prestigious family, was sidetracked from his career path and relegated to being a marginal employee. With his income significantly reduced, Paul was eventually dumped by his mistress, who had grown tired of him. I learned about these developments from Paul's mother. I received compensation from both Paul and his mistress. Especially from the Reed family, I received an amount well above the going rate. I presumed this included hush money. With the financial windfall, I've been able to afford luxuries like several overseas trips a year. The apartment prepared for me as a new home is mine to use as I please until I decide otherwise. Since Paul was hardly ever there, There's no reminder of him, and I live quite comfortably. Returning to work was the one good thing that came out of Paul's mess. Thanks to being coerced back into employment by Paul, I now have an income and don't foresee any financial troubles in my future. I occasionally keep in touch with my in-laws. They invite me to the Christmas gatherings, but I always decline.